Philip Brooks moved to Philadelphia in 1860. He was a recent graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary, and he was ordained and served as priest at the Church of the Advent. That same year, on Tuesday, November 6th, Abraham Lincoln received 1,865,908 votes, just 40% of the popular vote, to carry 18 out of the 33 states and secure the presidency against 3 other candidates with his 180 electoral votes. Because, yep, the Electoral College was still a thing back then. 1860, the year of Abe Lincoln's election and Phil Brooks' ordination, was the year that divided America. Only a few days before Christmas of 1960, South Carolina declared their secession from the United States, joined soon after by 6 other states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Missouri, Arkansas, and Virginia convened a secession convention but voted against it, and Tennessee and North Carolina held a referendum on having a secession convention, but it didn't make it past that stage. All this to say, he wasn't even president yet, and the 33 United States weren't looking very united. The secessionist activity was motivated by fear for what might happen to the institution of slavery in the South. The fear, or the hope, depending on who you ask, was that the president and the federal officials he appointed in the South, U.S. district attorneys, U.S. marshals, federal judges, etc., well, it would lead to the collapse of slavery. Spoiler alert, it did, but not without a fight. Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861, the same day that Philip Brooks, remember him, the Episcopal priest from Philadelphia, the same day he was unanimously nominated to be the rector at Church of the Holy Trinity in Philadelphia. Philip declined the position initially, and declined it again a second time, but when they asked him a third time, by then it was 1862, and he agreed to take on this new role. Back to Lincoln in 1861. He took no action against the secessionists in the 7 Confederate states, but also declared that secession had no legal validity. He refused to surrender federal property in those states and continued to reiterate his opposition to slavery. This standoff continued until April 12th, when Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, ordered the South Carolina militia to bombard and capture Fort Sumter, a sea fort in Charleston, South Carolina. Remember that from history books? It was a special fort designed after the War of 1812 to protect the harbor with high walls and heavy masonry. Construction began in 1829 and was still underway when the militia began bombarding the fort. Lincoln called for troops to put down the rebellion, wiping out the possibility that the crisis, not just the crisis at Fort Sumter, but the crisis dividing the nation, could be resolved by compromise. The Confederate states took the fort, and Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy. Now back in Philadelphia, Philip Brooks, do you think I forgot about him? He was writing letters to his older brother William. On April 29, 1861, less than 3 weeks after the first battle of the Civil War at Fort Sumter, Philip writes this: "Dear William, the war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, 'Peace, peace,' but there is no peace. The war is actually begun." Later that fall, in another letter to his brother, he wrote, "It is useless to talk round and round when we know and are sure that slavery, its existence in the South and its approval in the North, is the great crushing, cursing sin of our national life and the cause of all our evils." And then a year and a half later, in a Thanksgiving sermon at Holy Trinity, where he was finally serving as rector, he preached this: "We rejoice in emancipation because it is right. We hate slavery because it is wrong. The Negro ought to be free. He has a right to be free. God is showing us how to do it, and by God's help, we are doing it, casting this sin away." Philip's support of the abolition of slavery initially alarmed many in Philadelphia and even in his congregation. Before the start of the Civil War, most Northerners rejected slavery for economic reasons. But this prophetic rector rejected slavery as sin, something that the nation, both North and South, needed to repent for. When the war finally ended on April 9, 1865, Philip Brooks' preaching continued with one of his most well-known sermons. The eulogy he delivered on April 23rd at President Lincoln's funeral, who'd been assassinated 8 days earlier. In it, he said, "Slavery must die, because out of it and it alone came forth the treason of the traitor and the murder of the murderer. Do not say that it is dead. It is not, while its essential spirit lives. While one man counts another man his born inferior for the color of his skin, while both North and South prejudices and practices, which the law cannot touch but which God hates, keep alive in our people's hearts the spirit of the old iniquity. It is not dead. The new American nature must supplant the old. We must grow like our president in his truth, his independence, his religion, his wide humanity. Then the character by which he died shall be in us, and by it we shall live." Soon after all this, Philip left on a 1-year sabbatical, exhausted from a half-decade of war and calling a nation to repent of the sin of slavery. In that December, he was in Jerusalem, and on Christmas Eve he was invited to assist at the midnight service in Bethlehem. He borrowed a horse and made the 6-mile journey. In a letter to his father, he wrote, "After an early dinner, we took our horses and rode to Bethlehem. It was only about 2 hours when we came to the town, situated on an eastern ridge of a range of hills, surrounded by its terraced gardens." Returning home to Philadelphia in September of 1866, Philip continued his role as rector at Holy Trinity. 2 years later, and halfway through the season of Advent, he meets with Louis Redner, the church organist and Sunday school teacher, and he tells him that he's written a simple little carol for the Christmas service, but it needs a melody. Now, whether you know this snapshot of church and American history, you likely know Redner's simple melody and Brooks's iconic words drawn from a half-decade of Civil War and his sabbatical trip to Bethlehem. "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." Yes, these words are about a city in Palestine, but they also speak to the half-decade that Philip Brooks and the divided nation endured, especially those in need of their freedom, the hopes and fears of all the years, the hope of peace, the fear of violence, the hope of claiming your humanity, the fear of being someone's property, the hope of freedom, the fear of slavery, the hope of life, the fear of death. And this is where Brooks' poem and Radner's melody become so much more than another Christmas hymn or an implicit reflection on the Civil War and a trip to Bethlehem. The hopes and fears of all the years are still here today. The fear imposed by white supremacy does not squelch the hope for a world where Black lives matter. The fear etched into flags and monuments of a racist past, all in the name of heritage, will not stop the hope that takes them down and topples them over. The fear that fuels red hat wearing voters to drag a country back into the past, thinking that greatness only lives in an era where to be a person is to be white and male. This fear, nor the tweets of any outgoing president, cannot silence the hope that we embody when we build bridges rather than walls, welcome strangers rather than put them in cages, care for the environment rather than call it a hoax, and go high every time that they go low. This first week of Advent is all about hope. May we remember that in this dark street shines the everlasting life, and may this hope always meet and overcome our fear.
Oh, in the dark street shining, the everlasting and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight.
So this episode was obviously a little bit different than most episodes of The Word Made Fresh because I just wanted to share this with you. And throughout the season of Advent, I'm going to explore things like this. We're going to look at the history of some hymns, all sorts of fun stuff. Now, if you're a Riverside all-in, I listen and watch everything, well, then you might recognize this from Be Still and Go, our podcast, last Advent. I developed this then, and I reworked it for this video now. I'll be doing the same with some other episodes of The Word Made Fresh for the upcoming Advent season. So, enjoy. Okay, now I'm really gone.